My name is Bengi Akbulut. I'm the second presenter in the panel. Should I be closer to
it's only for the recording.
Okay, but if I'm here, it's
not
okay. So, I mean, the general motivation for the panel, as you know, probably understood, is the role of social reproduction and how to address it in the debate on democratic economic planning. And for me, it's a question that's been lingering for a few years, and some of you might have heard me complaining about it or having presented about it 2 years ago in the Great Transition Conference, the Historical Materials Montreal Conference. We had another session where I made an intervention on how to or how not to address social production in this debate. And to be fair, I think the debate has actually evolved in the last 2 years or more, maybe a few years, to actually explicitly take questions of social production, and I would say more particularly questions of care into account. So I think we made progress on that side, but of course I'm going to say that it's not enough. As an angry feminist, I'm going to complain about this. And I mean, to kind of, I'm going to assume that most of you are familiar with how this debate have evolved, but just to kind of point out, for me, some of the turning points. So, for instance, Robin Hohnell's and Michael Albert's Participatory Economics kind of started addressing the question of social reproduction more explicitly in how kind of healthcare, elderly care, childcare, and education would be democratically negotiated on and planned. So it's being addressed kind of explicitly in that sense, but kind of in a way separate than kind of workplace deliberations or how that would be kind of a part of community deliberations. There is some discussion again, like how communities, neighborhood community level councils would be deliberating on the level of public goods that would be, for instance, provided. But that's how social production, in a sense, becomes an input to production decisions. That's why they should be taken into account while also production is deliberated on, is kind of left aside. But on kind of apart from that, in the kind of more recent kind of evolutions or iterations of the kind of democratic planning debates, particularly I have in mind kind of as a good example of this is the latest edition, Creative Construction, and that kind of explicitly addresses questions of care and social production. And in kind of from my perspective, a lot of that also kind of ends up reducing the question to what I colloquially call who's going to take care of the kids, or kind of a matter of division of labor or a matter of compensation for this kind of work. And for me, it's a limited, or it's not enough, in the sense that for a lot of Marxist feminists who've been kind of writing on social production, and particularly the role of social production in the genesis and development of capitalism, it's not only a matter of a division of labor or how much to pay for it. So none of the socialist feminists are actually saying, okay, once we get the men or everyone to do this job, or if we pay for it, if we compensate it, then it's going to go away, or it's going to completely compensate or reverse the inequalities that is kind of at the center of the social production debate. So what they're saying are kind of more about how to conjoin or how to reconnect the field of social production and production. So I'm going to kind of take us to that field, and I'm going to argue that actually all of us who are in the democratic planning debate who take questions of social production seriously, and as a constitutive matter for the development of capitalism, we should be going back to those debates, and we should be reading socialist feminists a lot more, and how they conceptualize patriarchy and capitalism as kind of intersecting systems of oppression. So the first kind of thinker I want to take us back to is Silvia Federici. I'm sure you've read or you're familiar with her work, so I'm just going to kind of recap her perspective or her work that evaluates primitive accumulation and kind of the separation of producers from their means of production from the perspective of social production, as she puts it. So what she kind of shows in her study of how kind of primitive accumulation unraveled, or kind of, yeah, unraveled in Western Europe, and how that kind of led to a process of proletarianization, she kind of shows that it would not have been possible, so that process of proletarianization would not have been sustained if it was not for the subjugation of women's productive or reproductive roles and reproductive power solely to the reproduction of the workforce. So what she's saying is that the separation of producers from their means of production presupposes a field called social reproduction to be separated from the production. So under capitalism, it's the kind of for the first time, production and reproduction, there's a rift between them, so they're separated. And when you have a bunch of workers who have nothing to sell but their labor power, and they need to work in order to sustain themselves, then you need a bunch of other people who need to take care of those workers and who need to reproduce their labor power. So, kind of in a way, what Federici is doing, and I'm going to argue other socialist, Marxist feminists are doing, are kind of tracing how patriarchy became articulated with capitalism to this separation. Not that patriarchy did not exist before, but that it took a different form, a particular form, with the genesis of capital. So the formation of free worker for Silvia Federici has been enabled not only through primitive accumulation enclosures, and colonization and enslavement outside of the core, but also the subjugation of women. The second kind of thinker, scholar I want to bring in here is Maria Mies. And of course, these are kind of the emblematic works that I draw on, not the only works, but Maria Mies is a very parallel in her analysis of how kind of capitalism introduced this rift between production and reproduction and kind of developed through gender inequality above all. But kind of what I find in Mies that is also pertinent for this debate, in addition to kind of her the Federici argument, is that she also traces how this separation of production and reproduction came with connotations of one field, social production, as being natural. And she doesn't only mean housework, quote unquote, in this kind of social productive field, but also the work done in colonies or by colonies, if you will, and work done by nature. So she's kind of tracing how the work, the ecological work, the work in colonies and the work done by women are kind of cast as natural. Their natural comes as an instinct. And she argues that this definition of the field of social production as naturalized work was needed actually in a way to define the other field, the productive field, as productive, as human. So if you're familiar with debates on racial capitalism, it's kind of a similar idea. One set of bodies needed to be defined non-human for the other ones to be defined human. So it's a similar idea here. And she's also Federici does this too, and she's also tracing, and in my mind, Eva von Redeker has a similar, I think, idea, that with this proletarianization and expropriation, or dispossession, if you will, of the worker in Europe, came this field of social production. For Federici, she says the work of women became a substitute for land lost for these immediate producers. Mies says housewife and the nuclear family becomes the colony of what she calls the little white man, because the big white man are church and the state for her. So there's this more, if you will, ideological function of the separation for the reproduction of capitalist relations. And thirdly, and I think this is important, she's, and this is where reproduction and consumption, I think, are becoming connected a lot more explicitly, that the creation of housework, the creation of the housewife, as a separate field from the field of production, actually saves capitalism, because they are an agent, they become an agent of consumption. And throughout decades, throughout the development of capitalism, she traces how this this notion of the housewife has been mobilized in order to invent new needs. So this is kind of a resolution of the realization crisis. The third thinker, which might come as a surprise because he's not a socialist feminist or a Marxist feminist, or not identified as one, is Andre Gors, which also kind of approaches this idea, this question of the separation of production and consumption decisions, and how that's been kind of foundational for the development of capitalism. For Andre Gors, again, kind of this going back to the kind of loss of immediate producers over their means of production, and how that kind of created this rift between production and consumption, how that was necessary, not only to kind of to create this free autonomous worker who had nothing else to sell but their labor power, but also in order to emancipate both production and consumption decisions to happen beyond felt needs. So for Andre Gors, the kind of before, when autonomous producers, or before capitalism, production decisions were kind of coupled structurally to consumption decisions, in the sense that people produced what they felt they needed, and there was no kind of compulsion to produce beyond, kind of more and more, produce for the sake of production. But this kind of connection, the destruction of this connection with the rise of capitalism, Andre Gors says, actually what enabled kind of endless production to happen. So production is not kind of done for felt needs anymore. Production is not in relation to all needs, but that serves abstract needs of anonymous users somewhere else with the rise of wage labor. And then consumption through kind of commodity relations also becomes dominated by capital. So for kind of come back to democratic economic planning and how kind of to address or approach questions of social production, for none of these thinkers, the question is then just how much do we pay, or how much do we compensate for this unpaid work or the work of social production, or who does it. It's beyond that. And kind of the notions that they have developed, I mean, admittedly independently from kind of any idea of democratic economic or any debate on democratic economic planning, but as an alternative, is rather how to kind of reconnect production and social reproduction. And kind of, it's not a matter of, I mean, for instance, Silvia Federici is, as some of you might know, is affiliated with the Wages for Housework campaign. But it's, for her and for her comrade, it's never about actually paying wages. It's about how to define or kind of to reveal the work nature of housework and its connection to capital. So that's why they use the term wages, not paid. So, but the kind of the view that they have is not about kind of actually continuing to do this work for anyone in return for a wage, but smash the role of the housewife, as Maria Rosa Dalla Costa says it. So I have just to kind of point out two ways in which this reconnection has been discussed. One of them is the notion of social productive commons that Silvia Federici kind of talks about here and there. And this is not only kind of care work or about how to distribute care work, but rather she conceptualizes social productive commons as nodes of collective self-governance and reappropriating decision-making for our lives, in particular what our needs are and how are we going to go about fulfilling them. So it's not about only kind of a particular set of activities and kind of and distributing them kind of equally or democratically. So it's not only a matter of division of labor, but larger decisions on how the conditions of life, which presumably under post-capitalist society, what all production should be geared towards, reproducing the conditions of life. And that's what she means by counter-planning from the kitchen. Andre Gors has kind of a similar, I think, idea of an alternative, and he's talking about how kind of worker management in kind of a capitalist economy is not kind of the answer, but rather right to autonomous production, where he means communities or any social group kind of decides on what it needs and then kind of produces it themselves. So it's kind of not a model where someone else, another group, kind of independently decides what they need and then we take it on to produce, but kind of a way to, at a micro level, to conjoin these decisions. How am I doing?
Pretty good.
5 minutes.
I'm not going to talk about 5 minutes for food for thought. I hope we can talk more in the question and answer. So for me, as someone who reads and rereads kind of these social reproduction debates, and very fascinated by also the kind of democratic economic planning debates, still kind of one question that lingers for me is how to kind of integrate social reproductive implications of production decisions into kind of deliberation of production decisions. Because it's not only that social production is an input into production, but production will have implications for our social and ecological reproductive capacities. I think this is a more straightforward point in a way. You know, just treating it as an input that is endogenously determined through production. I think we can kind of work on that a lot more or a lot easily, but I think still I'm going to ask all of my comrades who work on democratic economic planning to think twice when they say deliberations in the workplace, because household is a workplace, community is a workplace. The second one is institutional settings to overcome separation of production and reproduction or consumption decisions. Again, I think this is being addressed or kind of being recognized, this separation, as underlying, for instance, the ecological crisis in kind of the more recent debates. But it's not only, I think there's also a tendency to see with kind of, I think, the more recent social reproduction theorists, for instance, Nancy Fraser talks about this separation only as if it's kind of in a functionalist way, as if this separation was done somehow intentionally by capital so that it can stop paying for the cost of social production. But what I kind of find in kind of this other debates or conceptualizations of social production capitalism is it's not that functionalist. It's kind of it's a more complicated story. Of course, it ends up serving that kind of cheapening the cost of social production for capital, but it's not a separation we can bridge by just paying for kind of that field. And so I think there's work to be done there. There's a lot more to think about there. And the third one, and I think this is a challenge for all of us, I mean, what does it mean to kind of address patriarchy in post-capitalism? So, or let me ask it this way. If capitalism is a patriarchal system, how can we address that? What does that say for us when we're conceptualizing post-capitalism? I'm not saying automatically that there are two separate systems, so post-capitalism can also be patriarchal, but I think the kind of patriarchy as a power system, as a system of power, as a system of oppression, maybe we should be thinking about how to address it beyond kind of social production, and how does that kind of figure into our debate on social production. Thank you.